Welcome back. Economist Xhanti Payi contends that South Africa's notion of qualifications becomes a narrow approach if it does not take into consideration competence and experience. Payi says this was shown in the public discourse that South Africa engaged in recent weeks. His view is that there are people who have developed experience and problem solving over the years without formal qualifications. However, a commentary by the Regenesys Business School says higher education has become increasingly important in the 21st century workplace, and individuals need to have high credibility on both education and experience. Interesting conversation. Let's continue it. Xhanti Payi is an economist and founding director at Nascence Advisory and Research. Xhanti, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Good morning, Leanna. It's very, very good to speak to you, and good morning to the viewers.
I've missed chatting to you. So before we get into this, what are your qualifications and your experience? We need to run through your work experience before I take you seriously. Seriously, I mean, let's talk to that. You know, something that is quite plaguing in this environment is we do take these things so seriously. We look at qualifications versus experience, and it seems that qualifications are the more preferable way to go, or are they? Talk to us about this.
Well, look, I mean, I think the question you always ask, and I think that's quite right when you say, what qualifies you to actually say what you're saying, or what qualifies you to do that job? And one of the things that I think we have to consider, especially at this time where the world is changing, we know that, there's a fourth industrial revolution, we're doing things differently, we're being more innovative, and I think, the post-COVID world has its own challenges. What do we actually mean when we say someone actually is qualified for that job? One of the things we've always said to young people, especially, is that, just because you've got a degree doesn't mean you know what you're doing. So what you're actually implying there is that, you need some experience in order for you to actually know to be good at what you do, to be able to ask for the remuneration. Because there we're actually talking about contribution. What are you going to contribute? Because it's one thing for you to have a degree, it's quite another to actually be productive or to contribute in a particular sector, in a particular job or role. And I think that is important to actually consider, so that actually people know that, it's either we're talking about the fact that you actually need a degree and then we think we are happy, or we need a combination of things. But also, of course, it is important. There is such a thing as prior learning, where people have been doing the work for a long period of time. And many of those people tend to be sidelined. And I think that's not useful, because obviously there is something to be said about experience, rather than to say, look, if you don't have a particular degree, then we don't get to promote you to the next level. And I think that's also unfair, in the sense that also we lose a lot by actually holding people back who've been doing a job, who knows the ins and outs, but because they don't have a degree, they don't get to be promoted to better things. So, and I think those things are actually things that we should contend with. They're really, really important. And one of the things we've been doing now, and I think this debate that we've had over, whether or not somebody is a politician and qualified, or as an engineer from Cuba and can help South African engineers, actually gives us a sense of where we should actually be thinking about these things.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up quite a few examples in your article. I mean, this article appearing in the Financial Mail, and we talk about some of the current examples that are currently around right now in the news. But I just want to go back, before we dig a little bit deeper into the article. I want to speak about, the perception out there is a lot of people would say, if you're going to have somebody as the Minister of Education, or somebody as the Minister of Mineral Resources and in charge of mining and things like that, that surely they have some form of a qualification, or the Minister of Health, some form of a qualification to be an expert in that field, and not just somebody who just comes in randomly and knows nothing about it. In those circumstances, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think there's something to be said about the qualification, the basic qualification. I mean, especially in the so-called professions. So in medicine, for example, I think, the Minister of Health should ideally have a degree. Actually, we're having the discussion with a friend of my mother's a friend, and they were, they're saying his mother is a doctor, and she was saying, one of the things that you have to contend with, in sometimes when we are facing, for example, a pandemic, is to first have a basic understanding of what is actually involved. So if I think about some of the things that we've been dealing with in the COVID virus, I think a basic understanding of what a virus is, and all, so that you don't have to teach someone the basics of what's the difference between this virus and that virus, and how is it going to evolve, how is it going to affect people. So that when you make the policy, or you're being advised at a with a certain base. So I think that is important. I think that would be the same maybe for the Minister of Justice. Maybe in other areas, for example, maybe it's not important, Minister of Education, maybe because even if you have some sense of understanding a bit, but those are things about literacy, right, and understanding and comprehension, which you want for some basic level of, of some, qualification that shows that you have a sense of grasping with basic concepts or with, not basic concepts, but with complex ideas and complex. So that is important, and I think that's important across in terms of what you are doing at work. That's one thing. But it's quite another to say, of course, there are people, for example, who never went to school. I mean, I think you'll remember, Leanne, the story of the gentleman who used to who assisted Dr. Barnard in the first heart transplant in the world, and he learned by doing, right? He didn't have a medical degree, but in the end, he actually was key and critical in even teaching students, surgery students. So what do we do about that? Do we ignore that experience and say, look, we can't put you in that, you must actually go back in your later years and go and actually study medicine so that you can actually impart your knowledge and you can actually be a useful person in society. So there are these important examples around experience. And I think the main problem that we have, especially, and I think, we did some work recently and with NEDLAC in partnership with the International Labour Organization. And one of the insights that comes out there is whether or not actually as we move forward, are we going to need new training or are we going to need retraining or upskilling? And those discussions are important because I think, people might be in industries that are old. But what is it going to take them to move you into the next level? Are we going to send everybody back to school? Or are we going to identify those competencies that are necessary to move forward? And I think that's important then, that the distance now between actually an education experience and then maybe a competency. Because we are now moving people around, some jobs are going away, new jobs are emerging. How do we actually bridge that gap? And our debate at the moment is worrying in the sense that it's very blunt. It's based on what is your qualification? Is your qualification, do you have a degree? Do you have an honors degree? Do you have a master's degree? Do you have a tech? And therefore, do you qualify? So, and I think these are the examples that I bring out in the article about what actually is a qualification, what qualifies you to do a job. And I think that's something that we should lean very closely to say, what qualifies you to do a job? And then once we know those things, then I think we can be able then to very directly bring people to those kinds of positions that we need them to be to actually make us a successful nation.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting perspective as well in the whole issue around the Cuban engineers coming into South Africa and assisting, whereas the headlines basically showing that Cuba's water system is in crisis. Lindiwe Sisulu, our minister, defending this, a lot of people defending it, but this comes with a heavy price tag. But the angle that you take is that, hang on a second, perhaps we can learn and impart some incredible knowledge, or they can impart incredible knowledge to us, particularly in the rural areas where there is no water and it is very difficult. And if, in a way, they've managed it, why are we snubbing them when perhaps we can learn from them? But the engineers here in South Africa say, no, we can work, we've got the experience, why are you giving them the money when we need the money? So try and balance me on this conversation.
Yes. So I think that's an important conversation because actually, it brings us some very, very important points about what even South Africa's history. In the first instance, of course, the conversation has been lost on unemployed graduates. So they say we have a lot of unemployed engineers in South Africa. Most of them are graduates. Of course, these complexities don't need graduates, right? Because as we've said many times, yes, of course, you're an engineer, but, do you have that kind of experience to be able to work in those complex, non-standard ways that are, I guess, non-textbook, as it were? Or are we going to create new problem-solving skills? So in the first instance, and I think there's been a very good debate now that says, look, we are talking about actually the engineers that are here, and mainly of them, of course, are consulting engineers to actually impart that. That's the first part. But the second part is, in the solutions that we are trying to get, in my understanding, is that we need competences in places where infrastructure is very poor. Infrastructure has not been updated in a very long time. We need particular skills and tricks of the trade, as it were. So we need people with that kind of experience. And then a good example, and I guess Cuba, in a very obviously demonstrable way, is that they've had many problems. I think it's shown the world over that they have many problems with their water sector. They have not been able, because of this political embargo, not been able to upgrade their infrastructure. So they clearly know how to work with the rural areas as we have, and old infrastructure. But I think also one of the important things about, that we know in South Africa is that for a long time, of course, when South Africa was closed and isolated from the world, we had to grow a lot of competency. And that competence has helped us a lot over a period of time. Now, we know, for example, we've got major health problems in South Africa, major health problems. But our doctors are still sought out the world over, even though we know that our health system in many areas has collapsed. Our health system is poor. It doesn't serve a lot of people. So if you were to ask someone, how is the South African health system? Many of us would actually hang ourselves in despair. But we know that our health professionals are sought the world over because of the experience that they've had in our health system. And I think that's true of our criminal justice system. Our judges, even though they preside over a justice system that is near collapse, that is under-resourced, we know that our jurists all over the world are sought after. And therefore, it actually speaks to the idea that actually people who are very experienced come from very difficult situations that are under-resourced. And that's how you actually gain experience and the tricks that you can impart to others. And I think that is an important thing with this debate. And we should not leave that behind, because as we keep doing that, we actually lose a lot of the people that have learned a lot of skills that can actually help us to come out of some of the most complex problems that we face. And those people must be retained. It doesn't mean, of course, that a basic education, a commerce degree is not important. Not everything is going to be learned by doing. We don't want doctors, for example, who don't go to university. Of course, we want that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also want to make sure that we are very close to the skill. We are very close to experience. And those are the kinds of things that are going to move us forward.
Yeah, it is. It's a very fascinating way of thinking, and it's important because, I mean, you actually, and it's an old saying, basically saying, you cannot put a price to skill. You can't. I mean, if you've got the experience and you've been working in a field, I mean, sometimes you are more qualified than a highly academic individual who has spent their lives studying, reading books, getting that qualification, all the way up to a professor. But there's been somebody that has been actively working in an environment since the inception, and has a lot more experience, but maybe not necessarily the degrees behind their names. I want to bring up something like an industry like yours. I mean, to be an economist, you need qualifications. I mean, it is quite a specialized field. But I remember this case that came up with Chris Hart, somebody that we used to speak to here on the program many times, and then there were questions about his qualifications as an economist, and that all of a sudden sort of took all the integrity away, thinking, well, he hasn't got the qualification. He's been talking rubbish all along. But has he really? He's been working in the industry. Maybe he knows it. What do you think?
Look, I think there's something important there, because obviously, I think that speaks very much to actually a base. As I said, there is a level and a base level in which you need some knowledge so that you can actually build your analysis on, you can build experience on, and that is very important. So nobody should abandon that. I think that's very important. I think in the issue of Chris Hart, I think that many economists who sort of felt, well, he didn't make a lot of sense in a number of issues, but he did have the experience. I always say to people, a qualification, for example, is very good because it actually puts you in a field where you actually have a grand understanding of things. But you need to interact with people. You need to interact with the data. You need to interact with research, and that helps you. And then, of course, the people's experience. When you meet people, then you have a sense of whether when we're moving forward, we're moving backwards, because you can't just sit in academia and not have that sense in terms of what is actually happening. And I think some of my best interactions actually, where people stop you at airports and tell you, look, I saw you on Morning Live saying this, but this is my experience. This is how I feel about things. And those are important. They are enriching. And I think that's important, because I think it moves us forward, because we are sometimes very blind to many of the descriptive things and the modeling that sometimes we do outside of actually the people's experience. And I think that's important. We've sort of thought ourselves as economists think of themselves as scientists rather than social scientists, and actually dealing with social issues on a daily basis. And that's very important to recognize. But I think that's true, I know, across disciplines, and we should actually be very, very careful that we actually have a good and strong balance. And that I think the question will always be now, well, how do we actually reach that balance, and how do we design a system that works both in an education system that is actually very well grounded and rooted, but also experience and competence. And what are those competences? I think we also don't define them. I make this example very on when the Minister of Public Administration says many people actually don't have the qualifications they need to be in public service. What are those qualifications? What is the qualification of a DG in housing? Do they have to have a degree in housing? What is the qualification of a degree in agriculture, or a degree in economics, or a technical degree in engineering? All of these things are important to consider, so that we know what are the competences, what should they be able to do, and therefore what should we actually back them up? What kind of training do they need? And I think sometimes those questions are left behind because we think it has to be something agricultural related. In the UK, many bankers actually have a degree in social science, even though this is about calculating and maths and all of those things. But we can mix those things, and we have to be very careful that we actually make the right kind of intervention.
And it really is. I mean, we, especially during this time of COVID, and everybody's an expert. All of a sudden, just because we have Twitter, that we see numbers coming out and we start analyzing them. We have no scientific qualifications or degrees to do this, but we know better than everyone, just as we know better than soccer coaches. We know better than I mean, even when it came to that whole WhatsApp privacy thing, suddenly we were all experts on technology and we knew everything, but actually we know nothing. And sometimes we need to leave it to the experts to do that. My final question to you, and very quickly, Xhanti, I mean, we're seeing that the DA are now going to, as you end your article, you talk to the fact that the DA are going to ask the Parliament Standing Committee on Public Accounts to investigate why so many civil servants are not qualified. And this coming from the DA, where it's always thrown in their faces that their party leader has just got a matric, and we see Natasha Mazzoni also being held to account for her education level. And then we see different leaders being pulled down for lying about qualifications. I mean, it seems to be such a common thread that moves through our politics.
It does, and I think because we've actually weaponized education and weaponized, and I think that has been done over a period of years to actually exclude certain people. So we say, if you don't have a qualification, then you're not coming in. But some people are allowed to because they've got experience, or some people are allowed to because they know someone. And that's what I'm trying to bring out in that actually we should not weaponize education. It is a very important tool on which we should base an experience as well. So it's about being weaponized, and I think that's what the DI, I suppose, has been guilty of over a long period of time. And now they have to be very serious about that, because as they think about that inquiry, they have to ask the question, what is the problem they are trying to solve? What are the questions they have to ask, so that we actually all end up at the right place, rather than actually that this is going to be a political process in which you actually weaponize it against, say, for example, an ANC public service. Rather to say, how do we actually move the public service forward? Rather use this as that opportunity, rather than to actually say, look, we're going to make sure we deal with all these cadre deployment, all of that. I mean, there is all sorts of questions that are important in this arena.
Xhanti, what a pleasure speaking to you. Love this. I'd love to hear people weigh in on this conversation as well. That should have been our question of the day. In fact, we should have been asking people qualifications versus experience. What do you think? But it's been a pleasure chatting. Xhanti Payi talking to us about qualifications and all of these things that are always under debate. He's an economist, of course, and director at Nascence Advisory and Research, helping us ponder the subject of skills, competence, and qualifications. So, yeah, that's where we leave it for today. Sakina, what do you think? It's a big thing.
It's a big thing. It's an interesting one, Leanne, because if you remember, there was a time when we were talking about a recognition of prior learning, and it's something that wasn't very well dealt with. But it is something that government has thought about, that they have, actually put into practice. But I think we stopped short of actually just making something really good out of it. So definitely, you cannot discount experience.
No.
So, and some educational institutions are actually doing a good job of the recognition of prior learning.
It's amazing. Well, listen, I love that conversation. Like I said, that should have been the question. Maybe we'll pass it over to tomorrow. Who knows? Have a beautiful day. It's been wonderful being with you. You're not in with us tomorrow, correct?
I may not be in for the rest of the week. It's Eid, so all these variables, things going on. So, but please take care to our Muslim viewers. If I don't see you again, Eid Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak to you and the rest of your family as well.
Thank
Good to
you.
have you. Take care. I'll be here tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye, everyone.